There is a street in the northeastern part of Berlin that does not feel like the rest of the city. The buildings are ordinary enough. The trees line the sidewalk the way trees always do in this part of Europe, patient and indifferent. But if you follow the address given on the memorial's website, you arrive at a gate, and the gate opens onto a courtyard, and the courtyard looks like something that should not still exist. It looks like something that was supposed to disappear. The building is large and institutional in the way that only certain buildings from a certain era can be. It is not elegant. It is not brutal in the architectural sense that people use the word to describe concrete modernism. It is something else. It is a building that was designed to be invisible while being enormous. It was designed to process human beings without leaving a visible trace of what that process involved. And in the basement of this building, below the ground floor, below the intake corridors, below the cells that had small windows near the ceiling where a prisoner might glimpse a rectangle of sky, there was a section that had none of that. No windows, no sky, no way to measure whether it was morning or midnight or whether any time had passed at all. In German, they called it the U-Boot, the submarine. The name was not official. It was the kind of name that circulates in whispers, passed between guards and between prisoners who managed, years later, to speak to each other and compare what they remembered. The name came from the sensation. Being held underground, sealed from the surface world, submerged beneath the ordinary life of the city above. The prisoners who came through those cells described something that is difficult to articulate without sounding like metaphor, but which was entirely literal. They described the feeling of having been removed from time itself. To understand what the U-Boot was, you have to understand what it was part of. Hohenschönhausen was not just a prison, it was the central remand facility of the Ministerium für Staatssicherheit, the Ministry for State Security of the German Democratic Republic. The institution known to almost everyone in East Germany and beyond by its abbreviated name, the Stasi. The Stasi was, by most serious estimates, the most comprehensively surveilling secret police apparatus in modern history. Not simply in terms of size, though the size was extraordinary. At its peak, the ministry employed roughly 90,000 full-time officers, and beyond those officers, there was a network of unofficial informants, the so-called inoffiziell Mitarbeiter, that numbered somewhere between 180,000 and 200,000 individuals at any given moment. In a country of roughly 17 million people, this meant that the apparatus of surveillance touched nearly every social unit, every workplace, every apartment block, every family. The Stasi did not merely watch East German society. In a meaningful sense, it was woven into it. But watching was only part of the mission. The other part was the management of those who had been identified as threats, or potential threats, or people who knew something about someone who was a threat, or people who had simply said something in the wrong room to the wrong listener. And managing those people meant bringing them here, to this building on Genslerstrasse in the Lichtenberg district of East Berlin, to be processed, questioned, and either released or moved deeper into the system. The history of the building begins before the Stasi existed. In the final months of the Second World War, as Soviet forces advanced toward Berlin, the Nazis used part of this compound as an auxiliary facility. When the Red Army took the city in the spring of 1945, the Soviet secret police, the NKVD, recognized immediately what kind of building this was and what it could be made to serve. For several years, from 1945 until the early 1950s, Hohenschönhausen was a Soviet special camp. The prisoners held there were not processed through any legal system that would be recognizable as such. They were held interrogated, and often simply kept, in conditions that survivors described as deliberately degrading in their physical severity. It was during this Soviet period that the basement facility was developed. The cells built below the main structure were different from ordinary detention cells in ways that mattered enormously. They were smaller. They had no natural light. The walls in some of them were lined with rubber, a detail that seems almost impossible when you first encounter it in the historical record, but which had a specific functional logic. The rubber prevented prisoners from injuring themselves during interrogation. It also absorbed sound. A person in a rubber-lined cell could scream, and the sound would go nowhere. When the Stasi formally took control of Hohenschönhausen in 1951, and the prison became part of the East German state apparatus, they inherited the U-Boot along with everything else. And they studied it. The Stasi, unlike many secret police services of the era, devoted considerable institutional energy to the theory of interrogation. They developed formal curricula. They trained officers in psychological technique. They drew on Soviet methods, but also, as declassified documents later revealed, on research from other sources. The goal was not torture in the physical sense, or at least not primarily. The goal was something that Stasi internal documents described with clinical precision as the systematic disintegration of the subject's capacity for resistance. The word they used internally was Zersetzung. It translates most directly as corrosion or decomposition. It is the word used to describe what happens to metal when it oxidizes, what happens to organic matter when it breaks down. Applied to a human being, it meant a deliberate, structured process of psychological erosion. Breaking a person not through violence, which left marks and created martyrs, but through a subtler and, in many ways, more devastating method. Disorientation, isolation, the manipulation of a person's sense of what was real. The U-Boot was the physical embodiment of this philosophy. When a prisoner was brought to the basement level, the most immediate thing they encountered was the absence of reference points. There was no clock. There was no window. The artificial lighting did not change to indicate the passage of day or night. Meals were brought at irregular intervals, so that the body's hunger could not serve as a clock either. The cell itself was small enough that movement was severely limited. A prisoner could lie down, sit, or stand, but could not pace in any meaningful way. The walls were close enough to touch from the center of the space. Stasi officers who trained in interrogation understood very well what this environment produced. The human nervous system is calibrated for a world of recurring patterns, light and dark, hunger and satisfaction, sound and silence. When those patterns are removed, the nervous system begins searching for them. It manufactures them from whatever remains. A person in complete isolation begins to hear things that are not there, begins to lose confidence in the sequence of their own thoughts, begins to doubt the reliability of their own memory. This is not metaphor, and it is not dramatic license. It is a documented feature of sensory deprivation, studied seriously by researchers who were, in many cases, trying to find applications for it rather than reasons to avoid it. The Stasi had access to this research. Their internal training documents cited it. They understood that several days in an environment like the U-Boot would not simply make a prisoner uncomfortable. It would alter the structure of their cognitive experience in ways that made them significantly more susceptible to suggestion, to pressure, and to the particular technique that Stasi interrogators were trained to deploy most effectively. That technique was built on the appearance of omniscience. When a prisoner was finally brought from the U-Boot into a formal interrogation room, they would find themselves across from an officer who seemed to know everything about them. This was not accidental. The Stasi had frequently spent weeks or months building a comprehensive file on a prisoner before arresting them. The file might contain intercepted letters, reports from informants inside the prisoner's social circle, transcripts of overheard conversations, photographs, financial records. When the interrogator opened the file and began to speak, the prisoner, already destabilized by their time in isolation, already uncertain of what they had said, and when and to whom, found themselves confronting someone who appeared to have witnessed their entire life. The psychological effect of this combination, isolation followed by apparent omniscience, was described by survivors with a consistency that researchers found remarkable. Many described a feeling of collapse. Not physical collapse, but something that happened in the interior of their sense of self. The private world that every human being carries with them, the world of thoughts that have not yet been spoken, of relationships that have not been disclosed, of convictions held in reserve, that world seemed to dissolve under the pressure of an interrogator who seemed to already know it all. In the formal literature of trauma, this experience has been described as a kind of identity rupture. Not amnesia, exactly, but something related to it. A severing of the connection between the self that existed before detention and the self that was being reconstructed or dismantled in the interrogation room. Some of the people who passed through the U-Boot were accused of serious political offenses in the framework of East German law. They were members of dissident groups, or they had applied to leave the country and been identified as security risks, or they had made contact with Western journalists or diplomats, or they had passed information to West German intelligence. From the perspective of the East German state, these were genuine crimes. The logic of the system, internally consistent if deeply wrong, treated every challenge to the authority of the party as an existential threat, and treated every person who posed that challenge as an enemy to be neutralized. But a significant proportion of the people who found themselves in the U-Boot did not fit that description at all. They were there because a neighbor had reported something, because a co-worker had filed a complaint, because they had said something at a dinner table that someone in the room had chosen to pass along, because they were connected, however distantly, to someone who was already under investigation. The Stasi's net was wide enough to gather in people who had done nothing except exist in proximity to suspicion. For those people, the experience of the U-Boot carried an additional layer of psychological damage. They arrived not knowing why they were there. They had no framework into which to place what was happening to them. They could not interrogate their own memory for the specific event that had triggered their arrest, because often that event was either trivially minor or entirely fabricated. In the cell, without reference points, without any way to reconstruct a timeline, they would find themselves combing through years of their own life, searching for the thing they must have done wrong. And the longer they searched, the more everything began to seem potentially incriminating. Every conversation they had ever had, every letter they had ever written, every joke they had ever told. This was not a side effect of the U-Boot. It was its purpose. After 1989, when the wall came down and the Stasi archives became partially accessible, and then when the Stasi Records Authority began the long work of allowing East Germans to read their own files, some of the people who had passed through Hohenschönhausen sought out what had been written about them. What they found was often as disorienting as the detention itself had been. Files that ran to hundreds of pages, reports from people they had trusted, observations so minute and so intimate that reading them felt like a violation committed retroactively. One man who had been held in the U-Boot in the early 1980s described reading his file as the second time he felt his sense of self come apart. The first time was in the cell. The second time was in the reading room of the archive, with a cup of coffee on the table beside him and the sun coming through the window, reading the name of his brother-in-law on a list of informants. The building closed as an active prison on the 2nd day of October 1990, the day before German reunification. The last prisoners were released or transferred. The guards left. The files, or at least the files that had not already been destroyed in the frantic weeks following the opening of the wall, were removed to the authority that would eventually make them available for research. The building itself sat empty for a short time, and there were discussions about what to do with it. Some argued for demolition. Others argued that demolition would be its own kind of erasure, that a place which had worked so hard to be invisible should now be made visible, permanently and without softening. The second view prevailed. In 1994, the building opened as a memorial. It is called Gedenkstätte Berlin Hohenschönhausen, and it receives hundreds of thousands of visitors each year. Many of those visitors are guided by people who were themselves once prisoners here. Former detainees who now walk through the corridors they once walked in handcuffs, explaining to strangers what those corridors were for and what they felt like from the inside. There is something about this arrangement that is difficult to describe without sounding either sentimental or absurdly clinical. A person who was systematically stripped of their sense of reality in this building now stands in this building and reconstructs reality for others. They walk down the stairs to the basement level. They open the door to one of the small cells. They describe what it was to be inside that space, in that darkness, without a clock, without a window, without a voice that was not the voice of someone who wanted something from you. The physical space of the U-Boot has been preserved. That is to say, the cells exist, the corridor exists. The absence of windows is not something that has been recreated as an exhibit. It was simply never changed. When you descend to the basement of Hohenschönhausen and walk the corridor of the U-Boot, you are walking in the same light, or rather the same artificial half-light, that the prisoners experienced. The ceiling is the same ceiling. The doors are the same doors. The smallness of the cells is not a reconstruction. It is the original. Visitors often describe feeling the weight of the space before they fully understand it, before their guide has explained the history, before they have read the panel on the wall. Simply walking into the basement, simply entering the corridor with its low ceiling and its closed doors, produces a physical sensation that several people, in interviews conducted by researchers at the memorial, described as a kind of pressure, as if the air itself were denser there, as if the space were pushing back against the ordinary expectation of openness. This is worth pausing on. What does it mean that a space can communicate something about its history before that history has been explained? Architects and phenomenologists have written about this. The way spaces carry meaning in their proportions, in their relationship to light and sound, in the quality of what they permit and what they prevent. A corridor that goes nowhere, a door with no handle on the inside, a ceiling too low to stand fully upright. These are not neutral features. They encode intention. They were designed to produce a specific experience in the body of the person who inhabited them. The U-Boot was designed by people who thought carefully about what a human being needed in order to remain a coherent self, and who then removed those things one by one. Light, time, sound from the outside world, the ability to speak except when spoken to, the sense of one's own physical location in relation to the world above. What remained when those things were taken away was a question the Stasi had studied and answered to their own satisfaction. What remained was a person who was significantly more malleable than the one who had arrived. A person whose capacity for resistance had been weakened not by breaking their body, but by dismantling the cognitive scaffolding that made coherent resistance possible. The question of who knew about the U-boot, and how widely within the East German system its existence and function were understood, is one that researchers have worked to answer from the surviving documents. The picture that emerges is deliberately fragmented. Hohenschönhausen was not listed on official maps of East Berlin. Its address did not appear in the city directory. The families of prisoners held there were typically told nothing about where their relatives were being detained. Prisoners arriving at the facility were transported in vans with opaque windows so that they could not track the route and could not, from memory, identify the location. Even within the wider East German legal and administrative system, the prison's operations were compartmentalized in ways that insulated the most sensitive practices from external scrutiny. State prosecutors who were nominally responsible for overseeing the legality of detentions had limited and carefully managed access. The Stasi was, in this respect, as in many others, a state within a state. It answered ultimately to itself. The U-boot, as the most extreme element of an already extreme facility, was subject to an additional layer of secrecy within that structure. Internal Stasi documents refer to the facility in ways that are notably oblique even by the standards of bureaucratic euphemism. The language circles around the function without naming it directly. Records of who was held in the basement cells, for how long, and under what specific conditions, are incomplete in ways that appear deliberate rather than accidental. This is one of the things that makes the testimony of survivors so important and so irreplaceable. In the absence of comprehensive documentation, the record of what the U-boot was and what it did exists primarily in human memory. In the accounts of people who came out of those cells and decades later found ways to describe what had happened to them. Those descriptions are not uniform. Trauma is not uniform. Different people, subjected to the same environment, experienced and processed it in different ways. But across the individual differences, certain elements recur with enough consistency to constitute something like a collective record. The loss of time is almost universal in the accounts, not simply the inability to know what time it was, but something more disorienting than that. The sense that time was no longer behaving as time normally behaves, that it was stretching in some intervals and compressing in others, that events from before the detention were receding in a way that felt faster than normal forgetting, that the cell was becoming, by default, the totality of the world. The shift in relationship to one's own thoughts is also widely reported. In ordinary life, thinking is continuous and largely unnoticed, the way breathing is continuous and largely unnoticed. In the isolation of the U-boot, several survivors described becoming intensely aware of their own thinking in a way that was initially frightening and then, for some, transformed into something else. Some described a quality of interior experience that had no normal analogue, a kind of enforced attentiveness to the self, stripped of the usual noise and distraction, that was at times terrifying and at times clarifying in unexpected ways. One woman who was held in Hohenschönhausen in the mid-1980s, arrested on suspicion of passing information to contacts in West Germany, described in an interview given to the Memorial's documentation project a moment in her cell when she made a decision. She could not say how many days had passed. She did not know what time it was. She had been interrogated twice, and both times the interrogator had presented her with information about her own life that she did not understand how he could have. She described feeling that her mind was a house that someone else had the keys to. And then she described deciding, in that cell, that whatever they had access to, whatever they knew, there was still something they could not reach. She did not frame this as heroism. She framed it as a small, almost accidental discovery. The discovery that even in a space designed to be total, there was something the space could not contain. She was eventually released. Many were. The Stasi's intention was not necessarily to keep people indefinitely. The intention was often to use the detention as leverage, to extract information or a commitment to cooperate, and then to return the person to society, where they would carry the experience of the U-boot with them as a permanent reminder of what could happen again. This is another aspect of the system that distinguished it from simpler models of political repression. The Stasi did not need to keep everyone in a cell indefinitely. They needed enough people to pass through the system that the knowledge of its existence would spread through East German society, and that spread would do the work of deterrence on a population-wide scale. You did not need to have been in a cell yourself to feel its influence. You needed only to know someone who had been, or to suspect that the person beside you on the tram might have been, or to be aware, in some half-conscious way, that the machinery of disappearance was real and operational. The philosopher Hannah Arendt, writing about earlier totalitarian systems, described the way that sustained political terror operates not just on those who are imprisoned, but on those who are not. The effectiveness of terror, she argued, is not measured only by what it does to the people it directly touches. It is measured by what it does to the people it keeps in a permanent state of potential touch. The awareness that one could become a subject of the system without any specific act of transgression, without any clear threshold being crossed, is itself a form of subjugation. It substitutes external surveillance for the internal censor. It makes a person their own jailer. The U-boot, as an extreme instance of this machinery, had an influence that extended well beyond the number of people who passed through its corridor. Its existence, known in fragments and whispers throughout East German society, contributed to the climate of self-censorship and managed performance that characterized everyday life in the GDR. The need to speak carefully in every room, the habit of editing oneself before speaking, of running every potential sentence through an internal filter. The exhaustion of living in a state of permanent performance, never knowing who was listening, never entirely certain what might be noted, reported, and eventually used. After reunification, when the scale of Stasi surveillance became publicly known, there was a period of reckoning in German society that was in many ways unprecedented. The opening of the archives allowed East Germans to read their own files for the first time. What they found was, for many, an experience of multiple betrayals layered on top of each other. The betrayal by the state, which had presented itself as a protector of the people, while in fact operating as a mechanism for their surveillance and control. The betrayal by individuals, colleagues, friends, family members who had contributed to those files. And then, for some, a more disorienting betrayal still. The discovery that the version of their own life they carried in memory was in some respects significantly less complete than the version contained in the Stasi's records. The memorial at Hohenschönhausen exists within this unresolved space. It does not offer simple conclusions. Walking through the building today, guided or unguided, you encounter the physical reality of what it was, without being able to reduce that reality to a lesson or a lesson. The tour does not end with a message. The corridor of the U-Boot does not conclude with a resolution. What it concludes with is a door, a small door in a low corridor underground, and on the other side of the door a cell, and in the cell the particular quality of air and light that exists in a space where natural light has never entered. You stand at the threshold of that cell and you understand, in your body before you understand it in your mind, what it would mean to be locked into that space. Not as an abstraction, not as a historical fact, as a physical possibility, as something that happened here to specific people, repeatedly, for decades. The city continues above. The trains run. The trees on the street outside the memorial drop their leaves in autumn and grow them back in spring. The building that was not on the map is now on the map. It is now, in fact, a destination. People travel from across Germany and from other countries to walk through it. Former prisoners stand in rooms where they were once interrogated and describe their experiences to visitors who were not yet born when those experiences occurred. There is something that the German language does very well that English struggles to match precisely. It is the capacity to hold together, in a single word or phrase, the complexity of an experience that contains within it its own opposite. The word for the memorial itself, Gedenkstätte, carries within it the sense of both commemorating and warning, of looking backward and forward simultaneously, of honoring those who suffered by insisting that what happened to them is not simply past. The U-Boot is still there, the cells are still there, the corridor with no natural light is still there, unchanged, under the ground, under the city that was rebuilt after the wall came down, and is now, in many visible respects, continuous rather than divided. But the discontinuity is also still there, if you know where to look, if you are willing to descend below the surface of things and stay in the darkness long enough for your eyes to adjust. The Stasi believed they understood what darkness did to a person. They built this place on that understanding. They used it methodically over decades on thousands of people whose names are still being recovered from the incomplete records, whose experiences still resist the clean narrative that history tends to prefer. What they did not fully account for, or perhaps could not have accounted for, was what would happen when the people who survived those cells outlasted the state that built them. When the government that had classified this place, that had removed it from maps and hidden it in bureaucratic language, ceased to exist. When the people who had been sent underground were the ones who emerged, in the end, to tell the story. The U-Boot was designed for erasure, and yet here we are, still talking about it, still walking its corridor, still standing at the threshold of its cells, and letting the weight of the space communicate something that words, even careful words, do not quite reach. The state that built this place is gone. The people it tried to erase are not entirely gone. Their absence from the official record of their time was never complete, because they themselves remained. They carried what happened to them out of the cell and through the years and eventually into the light. That is not a comfortable ending. It is not meant to be. There is no comfortable ending to a story that is still, in some sense, being told. What there is, instead, is the building, the corridor, the door, the cell, and the knowledge that someone designed all of this carefully, with full awareness of what it would do, and that the design worked, and that it worked on real people who had names, who had families waiting for them, who had entire interior worlds that this place was built to reach and dismantle. We walk through it now as visitors. We are supposed to feel something. The question that the space asks, without words, in its proportions and its darkness and its silence, is whether what we feel is enough. Whether memory, however carefully preserved, however honestly transmitted, can fully account for what happened here. The honest answer is probably that it cannot. But the attempt is not nothing. The attempt, made seriously, made without flinching, is the only form of accountability that remains available to us now. The building is still here. The city moves around it. And underneath it, below the ground, the cells wait with the particular patience of spaces that have already seen everything they were built to see.